Jenna, thanks very much. And thanks to you personally and to the entire Blackstone Library staff for hosting this and for hosting the first one around. It was really a lot of fun. And for those of you who aren't aware from the uh, publicity for this, we decided to go ahead and have a follow up um, because there were so many questions waiting in the chat room. So Jenna and I, and maybe some other people, will be moderating information from chat. I think this is still set up as a webinar, which means that we won't be able to like host audio from everybody, which makes sense because we'd have 100 people chiming in at once. So bear with us as we go through the chat. And if you ask a question and you don't see it or you don't hear it asked, uh, go ahead and just repost it, copy and paste it again, just so that we have a chance to catch up. Because last time we had so many participants and so many great questions that there was just no way to catch up. I look forward to seeing some of those same questions again, the ones that we didn't get to answer last time. So that's a little bit of the format here. Joe is going to go through, I think it was mentioned briefly, for those of you who've already seen it. For those of you who are fresh to this, as they taught me in the Navy, um, he's going to talk fast. You're going to have to listen fast. So enjoy that experience. Um, so as we go along, let me introduce myself a little bit more. I'm the president of the Brantford Historical Society. I'm pleased and honored to have that role. And it's especially great when a member of our own society steps forward, as Joe Naylor has been a longtime board member, and he's our House and Grounds chairman. And he'll talk to you a little bit about his interest in this particular topic if you didn't see the publicity already for this. Um, let's see. As a final note, until Joe tells me what I've forgotten, I want to thank Mike Russo, our program chair, who helps put our has for many years put programs together. I don't think he's online right now, but if he is, then you'll probably hear from him toward the close of the program. But as what I hope is the final note for the introduction, um, we are a all membership society. Most of our funding comes from membership, more than the Strawberry Festival, more than donations, more than people who buy postcards or publications or anything like that. And the way that we power our activities and the maintenance of the Harrison House, because believe me, we need to buy fuel oil for heat for that sometimes drafty old structure in the winter. We need membership. If you want to add a donation on top, but please, we really need members in order to keep ourselves going. So that's all I have right now. Joe, is there anything I forgot to mention or anything else I should say before I hand it over to you?
Not that I can think of.
All right. I think I've spoken enough and I will stop. I'll take my video off. I'm going to mute and I'm going to go grab some popcorn and some soda pop to enjoy this more. All yours,
Okay.
Joe.
Well, thank you, Matt. Thank you for that very nice introduction. The title of my presentation or program is Brantford Beginnings, or How Brantford Came to Be, and why it's called Brantford. So here goes. The story of Brantford starts really with the story of the Puritans, because the settlers of Brantford were Puritans. And what happened was, back in England in the early 1600s, the King Charles I declared the Puritan church illegal. So you could actually be jailed or persecuted for being a Puritan. And as a result of this, between 1630 and 1640, about 20,000 Puritans migrated to America, mostly to Boston, to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And among those were one of my ancestors, William Swaine, who 50 years old, sailed with his family to Boston to escape persecution in England. Now, Mr. Swaine lived in a town called Brantford, close to London. And in his day, Brentford was usually spelled Brainford or Brentford. And that's a clue to what's to come. The Civil War lasted from 1641 to 1666. Charles was beheaded in 1649. The Puritan Cromwell became Lord Protector of England. And this war, believe it or not, played an important role in Brantford's history. Like I said, Mr. William Swaine and his family first came to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, but not long afterwards migrated down to Connecticut, the Connecticut colony, as you can see by the map that I've shown here. And the Swaine family helped found the town of Wethersfield in 1636 in the Connecticut colony. And Mr. Swaine became a leader in the town of Wethersfield. As you can see on this map, the Connecticut colony composed most of what is today Connecticut. But there was also the New Haven colony during this time. And the difference mainly was that Connecticut was, the Connecticut colony was more liberal and consisted mainly of the Wethersfield, Hartford, and Windsor towns on the Connecticut River, and Hartford being the capital. Now, the New Haven colony was much more strict. They basically believed that only members in good standing of the church there could vote or participate in town government. Now, at the same time, there were the tensions developing between the Indians and the Puritans, because of course the Puritans had moved in and taken over much of the land that had previously been occupied by the Indian tribes in Connecticut. And at the bottom, you can see some of the tribes that played a role in Brantford's history. By this time, most of the Indian population had been decimated by smallpox and other European diseases. And what happened was that the English kind of had an easy time of it, because the Indians were 90% had died, and the villages were either depopulated or deserted. So the English could simply move into what had previously been had previously been Indian tribes, tribal villages, and and use the trails and rivers that Indians had used before. Now, this is a map of Connecticut at that time, and what this shows is that there were about 20. I don't like to call them Indian, but that's the way they were referred to usually in the old writings, from that time. But the Native Americans had about 20 tribes in Connecticut, and there were over 100 villages. And as you can see that, it's quite amazing, and the trails that that the Indians used to connect to one another were used. Well, going to the next slide, they were used by the English, when they finally moved into these towns, so that it was kind of like the state was set up, in a kind of sophisticated way. With the Indian population before. Now, in 1637, the Pequot tribe attacked farm workers in Wethersfield. And in this raid, 6 men and 3 women were killed, including one of William Swaine's daughters. And 2 of Mr. Swaine's teenage daughters were kidnapped by the Pequots. Luckily, they were later rescued by a Dutch trading vessel. But the 3 Connecticut colony towns, Wethersfield, Hartford, and Windsor, raised a militia and declared war on the Pequots as a result of this raid. And this militia surrounded a Pequot village in Mystic, and what followed was really a massacre, and between 400 and 700 Pequots were killed. Now, the Pequots, well, most of those that were killed were women, children, and older folks uh, as it happened. And the ones that tried to escape, after the village being set on fire, were actually shot down. So it was a terrible, terrible event in our history. And as a result, the remaining Pequots were horrified by this brutality. They just weren't used to this kind of warfare, and they were pursued by the militia along the Connecticut coast all the way to what is now about near Fairfield, and most of the Pequots at that time were actually killed, in this war and in this final battle in Fairfield. But the reason that this has an influence on Brantford's history is that as the militia, and many of the soldiers in this militia were from Wethersfield, they traveled along the coast of Connecticut, and they saw that in particular that the land which is now Brantford and New Haven looked like a good land to be settled probably in the future. And one of the militiamen was a man by the name of John Plum of Wethersfield, and he was later to become the town clerk of Brantford. But soon after this all happened, the community in Wethersfield became divided into two factions. One was very conservative and theocratic, and the other more liberal, much like the rest of the Connecticut colony. And so they called on Mr. John Davenport of New Haven to come up and help them settle this division. And he recommended that the conservative faction form a new settlement in Totoket, which is now Brantford, and which was under the jurisdiction of the conservative New Haven colony. Now, the New Haven colony had purchased Totoket in 1638 from Monowese, who was chief of the Totoket tribe. He bought it for they bought this land that's now Brantford and North Brantford and Northford for 12 coats. 12 coats. There were only about 11 braves and their families remaining in the Totoket tribe at this time. The rest had died from smallpox and the other European diseases. Now, in 1643, Mr. Swaine traveled to New Haven and purchased Totoket for his Wethersfield group of about 35 families. He paid 12.5 pounds, which was about the cost of a house at that time. Now, the Totokets had agreed to live in the shoreline peninsula to be called Indian Neck. And it was a reservation. It was one of the first reservations in our country. Now, you might want to ask later about Thomas Mulliner and Mulliner's Neck. And that's something that our Mr. Matt, who introduced me earlier, is an expert on. And you can see from this map that Indian Neck here is the peninsula where the Indians agreed to stay as kind of really kind of a reservation, but it was divided up into about 11 farms for the remaining Totoket families at that time. Mulliner's Neck was this little place right here, which is now Brantford Point. But you could see that there was quite a bit of water between Indian Neck and what is now central part of Brantford. Well, anyway, Mr. Swaine at this time leads his group of about 35 families from Wethersfield down to Totoket, as it was known at that time. A few of the men moved the livestock overland using Indian trails But most of this group came by boat down the Connecticut River, and they would have come around Long Island Sound and up the Brantford River, as you can see here. Now, the first settlers built simple wooden houses around what is still today's town green. And they also built a church almost immediately on what is now the town cemetery, or part of the town cemetery, excuse me. And when they had services on Sunday, which were pretty much all day in those days, two armed men actually stood guard during church services. There was a 12-foot high stockade fence around the church. They didn't have any problems with the Totokets, who were peaceful, and they got along very well with the English, with the Puritans settlers. But there was still a danger of raids from the more warlike Indian tribes at that time. And maybe because of the Pequot War, there was still a lot of fear, amongst the Puritan settlers of the Indians, in the area. There was a real possibility that they could be raided, and there was a real danger there. So one of the things they did was to build a 5-mile-long wooden fence, 4 feet 2 inches high, with 5 rails, enclosing the entire town. That is, they built a 5-mile-long fence all the way around the town. And this is the only town in New England known to have done something like this. Like I said, it was 4 foot. The directions were very clear and written in the early town records. It was 4 foot 2 inches tall. It had 5 rails, not 4 like this picture shows. But I don't think that could keep out an Indian raid myself. I think that it was probably more to keep the cows in, and perhaps maybe the wolves out, because they did have problems with wolves and bears and other creatures at that time. This is an early map of Brantford. The town green is color green. And as you can see, it looks pretty much like it does today. And I just colored the Swaine properties, my ancestors' properties, in yellow, just to illustrate that. And I was kind of curious about where these Puritans settlers to Brantford came from in England. So I could determine about half of the original 35 settlers, and I printed out a map of England and made these orange dots that, representing the different towns pretty much all around England, where the original settlers had originally come from. And the red dot here is Brentford, Brentford, which was, like I said, close to London. Now, Mr. Swaine was chosen as one of the commission of 3 people to kind of govern the town and to settle people's disputes. And here are some actual examples taken from the town records of disputes that were settled at that time. There was a conviction of Mary Dodd, a teenage girl, for being a wanton girl, and she was actually whipped by her father in the presence of the judges. There was a 10 p.m. curfew, and if you were caught out after 10 o'clock at night, you could be fined 12 shillings or get a whipping on Whipping Post Hill, which stood where the Baptist Church now stands. Sam Rose was fined 5 shillings for selling strong liquor to the Indians. And whosoever shall take away any man's canoe, be he English or Indian, shall pay a fine of 10 shillings. I can't read that one part of it. And for taking a paddle, 6 pence. And this was important because the Totokets needed their canoes to cross from Indian Neck over to where the main part of the town was, which was separated by the Brantford River, and it was pretty marshy also, you know, in that area. So it was kind of a wide expanse of water to cross. And it was another 50 years before a bridge was built from Branford town proper over to Indian Neck. So it wasn't easy getting back and forth. The Indians helped out quite a bit actually too, with hunting, uh, for uh, well, they were paid for for hunting bear and wolves and other dangerous animals were a problem. Now the town name soon changed from Totoket to Branford. Uh, the early documents spelled the name Branford. If you go back and look at the actual old town records, that were actually handwritten down by John Plum at that time. And John Plum was the town clerk for like 21 years. And the records are still existing here in Brantford, and you can actually go to the library and find the records from this period in the Brantford's history. It's extremely interesting. Some of the stories, some of the things that happened back in those days. Now, as far as I can tell, the Swaine family, at least as far as I could find out, was the only family from Branford or Brentford, England. And I think that might have had something to do with why the town is called Brantford today. So now we live in the town of Brantford and not Totoket, Connecticut. Now the Brantford settlers were mostly farmers. They were very industrious. They worked from dawn till sundown. They had cattle, sheep, pigs, and chickens. They drank beer and hard cider. They didn't trust the water. The water wasn't safe even in those days. And even the kids drank the beer and hard cider. But I found out after doing a little research into this that they would heat the beer first before letting the kids drink it, because I had this vision in my mind of all these little kids kind of stumbling around half drunk all the time. But they ate well, they liked beer, and they liked having a lot of kids. Most of the families had 9, 10, or even 12 kids in those days. There was also a pretty good shipbuilding and maritime industry in Brantford at that time. And Brantford had the best natural harbor between New London and New Haven for the boats that existed at that time. Later on, as ships got larger, Brantford's harbor was just shallow. Whoops, I think I just skipped. So I was going to say, please ask later about the ironworks in Brantford. That was another industry. And here's a hint, it wasn't the MIF. With no church bell, the town used a drummer to call people to church and to town meetings, and also to go around in the morning to waken people about a half an hour before sunrise, so that the cows in town could be collected from all the different families and taken out to pasture and then returned in the evening. Another question you might ask later on is about a lawsuit involving a bull rented from Guilford to be with, as they expressed it, the town's cows. It's kind of a humorous story from that period of time. Now the town had a few part-time jobs. They would hire men for the year to do certain functions. For example, the drummer, was paid usually these people were paid in bushels of Indian corn or produce, that sort of thing. There was very little actual currency or English currency at that time in the colonies. But the drummer would drum to call people to church, to town meetings, and if you were late, you were fined. And if you didn't show up at all, you were fined even more. There was another man who was hired for each year to inspect the fence around the town. And each family was responsible for a section. And there were fines if the fence was not maintained. And I think the real reason for this was to keep animals from straying outside the town limits, because that was another problem, and one of the reasons why there were disputes between members, settlers of the town, was because one family's pigs would get into their neighbor's vegetable garden or something, and this type of thing. Now, and one fellow was actually hired for the year to keep the young boys behaved in church. So even though the young kids worked right along with the grown-ups and didn't have a lot of time, for play, I don't think. I'm sure they did find time to have some fun. Now, one of the most important things that happened in the history of Brantford was that Abraham Pearson came to Brantford from Southampton. At that time, Southampton was under the authority of the Connecticut colony, and he didn't like that. He was a more strict Puritan, and so he came to Brantford to become the minister of the First Society Congregational Puritan Church. The Puritan Church later became known as the Congregational Church, as I'm sure most of you know. But Mr. Abraham Pearson was a powerful influence in the town for 21 years. The church was very powerful. It shared in the town's governance. It alone could buy or lease land from the Totoket tribe on Indian Neck. And over the course of the next several decades, the church actually bought up all the farms that had been owned by the Indian Totoket population. And gradually this Totoket population decreased until probably in the early 1700s. There were very few Totoket Indians left in Brantford. Reverend Pearson, one of the things that he did was he actually wrote a catechism in the Totoket language. And this was actually the first book that was printed in the Connecticut colony, this book by Reverend Pearson. And he regularly preached to the Indians. He didn't have much luck, though, in converting them, to Christianity. He also presided over the only witch trial in Brantford. And he was a strong advocate of theocracy and caused half the people of Brantford to leave later in 1667. Now, another interesting question might be for someone to ask is about this trial for witchcraft held in Brantford, the only trial for witchcraft held in Brantford. Now, before too long, the settlers were building colonial homes similar to the ones being built in Boston, and wood was plentiful. So as you can see here, the typical center stairwell, 4 room, 2 up and 2 down, salt box, in the rear, type of colonial home. And they usually had these homes had usually a large hearth that was used for cooking, for heat, for candle making, for soap making. It was really the center of the home, where families gathered, to do work in the house or just to be together as a family. They did their own spinning in the earliest days. They spun wool, flax, and a colonial wife could actually walk 20 miles a day working the great wheel, which was used for spinning wool, walking back and forth all day long. And small children helped by winding the yarn around the ninny nanny, that clock type device that you saw in the previous slide. This is a loom. Families often had a loom in their homes for making linen, for clothes, for bed clothing, etc. And it might take 2 months of labor to produce one linen shirt from the flax plants that grew in Brantford, and then were also planted as a crop by practically every family. They spun the flax into linen. These linen clothing were very, very durable, were often passed down from generation to generation. And typically in this earliest time, a family would have, family members would have 2 sets of clothing, one for work and one for Sunday service. Now, another interesting question you might want to ask later would be about the occurrence of slavery in Brantford. Now, in 1661, after Cromwell's death, Cromwell was a Puritan, Charles II returned from France to restore the English monarchy. And this was to have a great impact on Brantford, believe it or not. Because when King Charles II decreed that the New Haven colony, including Brantford, would now come under the authority of the Connecticut colony, Reverend Pearson, who was a very strict Puritan, believed that the church should have the last word in the governance, did not like this. And he along with Samuel Swaine, who was very close actually to this Reverend Pearson, decided that they could not live as part of the Connecticut colony, the more liberal Connecticut colony. So they persuaded half the people of Brantford to leave Brantford, set sail, and they sailed down the Long Island Sound to New Jersey, where they founded Newark. Believe it or not, settlers from Brantford founded Newark, New Jersey. Now, Samuel's brother Daniel and his 2 sisters remained in Brantford. But Brantford quickly recovered from losing half its population, because at this time we're getting into the 2nd and 3rd generation, and families, like I said before, were large. So people were looking for homes and farms, and so the Brantford fairly quickly, once again recovered its population. Many of the people came from Wethersfield, actually, down to Brantford. They probably had friends or relatives that going back to the original settlement of Brantford. Another interesting thing that happened in Brantford's history was that in 1700, a group of 10 ministers met at Reverend Samuel Russell's house in Brantford to found a college. And this college eventually became Yale University. Now, Abraham Pearson's son, also named Abraham, who happened to grow up in Brantford, was the first president of Yale University. Now, today, the Brantford Historical Society maintains the Harrison House as a museum and provides tours and school programs. Our website is here, BrantfordHistoricalSociety.org, and we would like to ask everyone who's not a member now to please consider joining. As Matt said earlier, it's been a tough year for the society as well as for everyone else, and so we are really looking for new members to the Historical Society to expand, this really wonderful organization. And so that was a quick run through of my presentation from about a month ago. So I'll now turn this meeting back over to Jenna for questions. Hope be lots of questions that you might have.
Yeah, if anybody has a question, you could just type it in the chat box, and we will. I'll read it out, and we can get some very informed answers. So, Joe, is there anything? I know you dropped some hints on some questions you might be interested in answering. Is there anything you particularly want to talk about?
Well, yeah, sure. One of the questions that I suggested was there any history of slavery in Brantford? And looking into this, there's no history of when the first slaves were introduced into Brantford, but there, in doing research, I found that at least in 1771, there was one family, the Rosewell family, that had 5 enslaved people, and it was listed as part of their estate. And that's why it was contained in the historical record. And the way it was expressed was that along with all the other possessions that this family had in the estate, because someone had died and the estate was going to be passed on, the family had 5 enslaved persons, and it said that these would be passed down on to the next generation, including any additional children. There was a man and wife with 3 children. And in 1740, there were, according to the census of that time, at that time, there were 130 enslaved people in Brantford. The population of Brantford at that time was 1,600. So there were almost 10% of the population were enslaved people, which is, I found kind of surprising when I first learned this.
Yeah, Joe, that seems like a high number. We do have a question by chat. Oh, well, we've got a few of them. First off, from Tabs Laptop 10 to everyone, please tell us about the witchcraft trial.
Okay. What happened there was this story was actually written by or recorded by Cotton Mather, who is a historian in New England at that time, a prominent historian, you could say. And what happened was there was a teenage boy in Holland, and his father and the family were unable to, I guess, control him. He was kind of out of control, a real problem. So he was sent over to Brantford, either Brantford or New Haven, to see if he could be straightened out. And it seemed that he was subject to seizures, and I guess was just a problem. And so it seemed to me that unfortunately he probably was suffered from epilepsy, but he was actually brought to trial by Abraham Pearson, presided over the trial in Brantford, and he eventually confessed, to all the charges against him, and was convicted of being a witch. And as Cotton Mather described it, the devil actually picked him up and cast him into a hog pen, at which point the hogs all ran off screaming to escape from this poor boy. And he climbed over the fence and ran into the, as it was described, the dark Totoket woods. And unfortunately, there was no record of what happened after that, to this boy. But he was actually convicted of being a witch.
All right, Joe. Thank you for that. That's interesting. That for those who know the story, there's a biblical story about being possessed and the pigs and things like that. But people,
and
otherwise,
this happened in about 1653. It's pretty early. It was after the witch trials up in New England. And the other thing, that there were witch trials in Hartford, in Connecticut, and several, mostly women, were actually hung in Hartford. And one interesting story I read was that a wife was accused of being a witch and was convicted, and her husband was executed also. I guess because they must have felt that he must have somehow been responsible for his wife's, but the both of them were executed. So there were some pretty gruesome stories.
Yeah, that did.
Lines.
Oh, I'm sorry, Joe. I thought you were done. Yeah,
no, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I think Walt Woodward, state historian, has at least one podcast on his Grading the Nutmeg program about witchcraft trials in Hartford. If it's not there, I know it's somewhere else. That question also came from Britt. Another question from Bill Fryer is, are there streets or places that still bear the names of founding families? And there are too many to name, but Jane Booley, town historian, has written a book. I think it's called The Streets of Brantford. Is that the correct title, Jane?
Correct.
Yeah, so that's available for sale. You can look that up. It might even be available through the Historical Society website. I didn't want to stare at my screen while looking that up, but I think it's available there.
At the library also.
Okay, good.
Yes. We have it to check out and to purchase, I believe.
Dennis nodding for that. Someone who's participating named Tim said, the small building on the south end of the Green on South Main Street, what is its history? I think Tim's referring to the Academy on the Green. That's got a long history. Again, too long to go into here, but it's been moved, I think, twice.
I think so too.
Yeah, I'll jump in, Matt, I'll jump in. It was built privately by Reverend Timothy Gillette, who was the minister of the congregation, longtime minister of the Congregational Church, but the building was not associated with the church. He did this privately to have a private school or academy, and families paid a share or paid into letting their children go there. So it originally stood where the town hall is today. Then when the town hall was built in 1854 or so, it was moved to the back of the Congregational Church, and then later got moved when the Congregational Church built an addition to the location it is today in 1972.
Right, right. I recall seeing a print of that showing, I think it's tractors and oxen pulling it, but I'm not sure.
And subsequently to Reverend Gillette owning it and it being a school, it was purchased by Widow's Son Lodge, which is the Masonic group in Branford, and they owned it for over 100 years, and then turned it over to the town when it was moved in 1972.
Yeah, and there is actually a town commission or committee for the Academy on the Green. It's available for rent. Art exhibits and things like that are have been put on, and post COVID-19, I'm sure will be put on again. Gary Beach asks, Connecticut seems to be a Native American name. What is its origin? I believe it means near the Long Tidal River, but that's another good one for a web search to find out exactly which language or dialect that comes from.
That is true. As far as I understand it too, it was pretty close to the Indian pronunciation too. I think Connecticut or something like Pennockinock, river, Long Tidal River. And also it's interesting that one of the well, there are two different opinions about Totoket, where the word Totoket comes from. And one is that it refers to the river, the Brantford River, and that also means tidal river, a long tidal river. And the other theory is that it refers to the hills in North Brantford, where the Indians would go in the wintertime. I should say this, it's very interesting about the Totokets and in general, the Indians along the shoreline. They had a very good time of it in the summer. They lived in Indian Neck, Stony Creek, on the islands, on the Thimble Islands. It was kind of like a clam bake, a summer-long clam bake. Food was plentiful. And then they would move up into the hills where there was more protection, from the weather in the wintertime. But I just found that interesting. And one thing I read too was that when the settlers first came to Brantford, the Brantford River was navigable for ocean-going ships, for larger ships for 2 miles, and for smaller boats, river-type boats, for 3 miles. And since that time, the river, has become silted very much more than it was in those days. So it was, the Brantford River was more navigable by ships and boats than it is today.
Interesting, right?
Yeah.
We have another question. Adding to that, a couple things where people can do further research. Many of the Native Americans who lived around here moved out. Basically, they didn't see a future for themselves here.
Yeah, by about 1740, there were really very few Indians left in the Brantford community.
Yeah, we do have a basket made by Asa, who's buried in Center Cemetery and has a grave marker there. But many of them left and they joined the Scaticoke group up in Kent, Connecticut, where my mother's from. So interesting area up there. And I'm sure Jane could talk for an hour about the history of Native Americans here, but let me make sure we get through questions. From Jay Gravina, what is the significance of Mr. Rose, who was fined for selling liquor to the Indians? Is this the same Rose family we know from the new winery? Yeah, I actually met with one member of the Rose family yesterday, and we were talking about his winery and original land holdings. So I'm positive that all the Roses who came here at the beginning were related to each other, and that I know that they are direct descendants of people who own the land in North Brantford. North Brantford, of course, having been part of Brantford for many years until it I guess you'd say gained independence because it was too far to travel to church on the Sabbath.
Exactly.
Yeah. And Tab's laptop asks, I'm curious about the lawsuit involving the bull. So Joe, do you know anything?
Yeah, this is kind of a funny story, and it's also connected with the Rose family, you know, as a matter of fact. And what happened was back in about, I think it was 1653, a lawsuit was filed in New Haven by a lawyer representing Mr. Robbins in Guilford, who claimed that people from Brantford had stolen his bull. Now, a few weeks passed, and this referred back to the summer, the previous summer. This lawsuit was filed in November. A few weeks later, in the next time that the trial was in session, the members of the Brantford community appeared in court and said, no, no one stole this bull. We actually went up to Guilford, and one of the people was Mr. Swaine, and also Mr. Rose was involved in this. He said, we didn't steal the bull. We arranged to rent the bull for the summer to, as they put it, be with our cows for the summer. And so a few more weeks go by, and once again they appear in court, and the Mr. Robbins' lawyers says, well, we were never paid. You know, okay, we agree that we agreed to rent the bull for the summer, but we were never paid. It was going to be 20 shillings for the rental on this bull. We were never paid. And to this, the representatives from Branford said, well, the bull died and never was with our cows, so we don't feel that we should have to pay this 20 shillings. A few more weeks went by. They once again appeared in court. And at this point, Mr. Robbins' lawyer said, well, we agree that the bull died, and we hold the people in Brantford responsible for being irresponsible and taking care of our bull. At this point, the judge said, you know, I've really had it up to here with Mr. Robbins' bull. He says, I think, well, my advice is to the people of Brantford is that they pay the 20 the 20 shillings for the rental on this bull and be done with it. Otherwise, I'm not sure how this is all going to work out. So the people of Brantford begrudgingly paid the 20 shillings to Mr. Robbins, even though the bull had not performed as it was hired to do. What had happened was that the bull, while in Brantford, had stumbled into a mud hole and actually died. And so as it turned out, like I said, the Brantford people begrudgingly paid the 20 shillings. Poor Mr. Robbins was out, his bull, and that was the end of the story. The judge said, I've just had it up to here with this bull, but that's it. It was kind of a funny story.
That is funny. We obviously have been and still are a litigious society.
Yeah.
Our English forebears.
Oh yeah, these things, some of these stories of that time were just amazing. Some of the things that people got into. I mean, typical lawsuits were things like one man was accused of putting his brand on another man's horse. A lady was accused of milking her neighbor's cow. This type of thing. So there was there was typical things that I guess that would happen in a town.
like things that happen today, except with for cattle.
Yeah.
Let's see. Another question from Britt related to Gillette Castle. So, Britt, if you want to unmute yourself, I realize that we're probably not in the webinar format. We're in standard thing. So, go ahead. What's the exact question about the Gillette name?
Sorry, someone mentioned something about Gillette, and I just had, it was more relevant at that moment. I'm not even sure what they had said, but it was something about Gillette, and it just made me wonder if there was a connection to Gillette Castle, which is a phenomenal place to visit.
Yeah,
I agree.
I'll jump in. Timothy Gillette did have children, but to my knowledge, William Gillette that built the castle is not a descendant, but I don't know that absolutely.
Yeah, not a super uncommon name.
Yeah, Gillette
Yeah.
was a pretty common name in Connecticut, down in New London County and also in Hartford.
Okay, thanks. I was just curious.
Right. It's like the name Griswold. There's so many Griswolds around and so many historic places named Griswold. And they're all like,
Yeah.
nah, that's not my family. Let's see. And a question from Chris. When did they change the spelling of the Swaine name? Because the Y changed to an I, et cetera, Joe. Any thoughts about that?
I could take that. It's pretty interesting because when you go back to the town record, written by John Plum, when he was the town clerk from 1646 up until, about 20 years anyway. That's about 20 years. It was actually spelled Swaine, but other places it's spelled Swayne. So I think, back at that time, people just kind of spell things, phonetically, and there's many different spellings, for names and places, towns. When you look back at the original writings of that time period, it was the spellings were just all over the place. So I don't have a definite answer to that. It just it was spelled both ways, and like I said, quite often Brantford in the earliest record was spelled Brainford, like Brantford, which was very close to the spelling at that time of Brentford in England, which I think it's generally accepted that the name Branford came from the town of Brentford in England.
Right, that makes sense. Let me take a look at further questions. Those are the questions we have right there. I will say there's one other town of Branford in the United States. That's down in Florida, and it's actually named after Branford, Connecticut, because of the Morton plant link. And I noticed I wanted to note before we finish up here. We talked a little bit about Hartford and New Haven colonies, and the whole stories of the charters and the name Constitution State is interesting and bears more research if you're not familiar with it. The New Haven Museum, unfortunately, I think it reopened and then closed again because of COVID-19. But that's a great place, and you can really dig deep into the, kind of short and unfortunate history of the New Haven colony. Thomas Mulliner came up. Apparently, Thomas Mulliner.
You should talk about that, right?
Right. So everybody here has access to the internet. You can do a web search on the phrase Mulliner's Neck, and you'll turn out that the original family name is Molyneux, which is French. It might even be a French Huguenot name. And it talks all about the history of Mulliner's Neck, the part of town where I live, now called Branford Point. I noticed that we have at least two local authors. We've got Bob Barnett, who has written about history and culture in the area and gave a great presentation. I think it was our last presentation before we stopped in-person presentations because of COVID-19. And of course, Jane Booley, who has a number of publications available through the Historical Society and otherwise. And if you're also an author and you want to be recognized in this forum, go ahead and type into chat. We talked about the witchcraft trial.
Hey Matt, if you just a minute, just a little bit more about Mulliner's Neck. Thomas Mulliner was probably in what's now Brantford even before the New Haven colony was settled. His family were mariners. They had spent time in the Caribbean. He came up, and somehow or another was kind of a homesteader and settled in what's now Brantford Point in Brantford. And he apparently had his own arrangement with the Totoka Indians, permission to have his farm there. And so he felt that when these settlers from Wethersfield came down and said, no, we own this, he wasn't too happy about that, because he felt like he owned, he owned his section of town. And there was friction. He was constantly in court, but at the same time, he was also very helpful to, the settlers from Wethersfield. And at one point, and I think it was in 1648, he was quite a carpenter, and he built a sign saying the King's Highway, which was the name that was given at that time to Main Street in Brantford. And so he actually posted a sign that he had constructed, I think in around 1648. But that's a pretty interesting story.
Yeah.
The other thing, I'm sorry.
Just a second, Joe, before we move on from Thomas
Yeah.
Mulliner, I just put a link into the chat from the Molyneux family website. They're all around the world. It's not an uncommon name.
Yeah.
We can click through that and move that off to the side of the screen. But go ahead, Joe.
No, I was just going to say the other thing that I didn't mention was that there was an ironworks in Brantford, in around I think it was in 1650s, 60s, and they actually got iron ore from North Haven. I forget that it was a certain type of bog ore, iron ore, and they brought it by ship down the Quinnipiac River, around and up, into the Farm River up, and it was right at the southern end of Lake Saltonstall, what we now call Lake Saltonstall, and they actually had a smelting site there, an ironworks. That was fairly important, in those early decades of Brantford. So
right. Instead of having to import that, and Woolley may know more about that, but I've heard the history with the salt and stall and
So there were a lot of things going on. There were a lot of things going on in those days.
Oh, and I get a note from Jenna. I just sent the link to her instead of to everybody about Thomas Mulliner. So let me go ahead and resend that. Jenna, thanks very much. And I'll repost that link. There you go. You can cut and paste that into a dialog box or Word or something, or you can click right through the link and open it in another tab. Okay, so let's see. Any other questions? Let's see. Oh, are those ruins at the end of Beacon Hill Trail for the Ironworks? That's from Bill Fryer. No, I think that. I'm sorry. Does Bill Fryer? Do you mean? You can unmute yourself. At the north end of Beacon Hill Trail, or down toward the south end near the trolley trail?
At the south end, you come to a point that kind of is between the Farm River and the marsh to the east. And there's these old stone ruins, and you can see spots where there was wooden beams, but there's no wood left. So they have to be pretty old.
Sounds like I've got to take a walk.
Oh yeah, that's my favorite trail.
Matt, I'll answer that. Jane Booley speaking. Those are the remnants of the crushing buildings. There were two of them, I believe, when Beacon Hill was a trap rock quarry. This would be late 1800s. It was fairly short-lived, 1895 to about 1905. And there was two fairly large buildings with wood on top and wooden beams, and that's all that's left of those two crushing plants. And then they would bring that trap rock by barge down the Farm River to Long Island Sound.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Jane.
Yeah, that's really neat, Jane. Thanks, because those trap rock ridges run all the way up into Massachusetts and maybe even further north. My dad, geology was part of what he taught at Southern Connecticut, and it's hard to believe that Tilcon and everything, all that trap rock runs just forever north in Connecticut. And you travel north in Connecticut, and you see another Tilcon place where they also have trap rock processing facilities.
I
Let's
was
see.
gonna,
Go ahead.
Matt, I should tell you that I pick up the mail for the from the post office, and there was a brochure the other day from the New Haven Historical Society, and they're actually having a Zoom program about trap rock sites in New England. You know, that's going to, I think it's going to be in May sometime, so I'll get in touch with you about that.
Oh, that's cool. We'll send out a link through the historical society. Mike, if you can take a note of that to pass it on to people who do publicity.
Yeah.
And from Britt, a question about whether we could be so kind as to put their book titles in the chat. So let me go
Sorry,
ahead.
I didn't mean to send it to just you.
No,
I was
that's
just
okay. I
curious
see it.
what they are.
But Jane's books, I think all of Jane's books are listed on the Historical Society website. That's
Cool.
BrantfordHistoriocSociety.org. And Bob Barnett, if you want to chime in, I'll go ahead and try to type accurately while you're talking. What books do you want to direct to people's attention? Bob was here a minute ago. You can unmute yourself, Bob, if you want to. For a little while, we saw just his dog, but oh, no. I don't see him on his screen. So his full name is Robert Barnett, and I know he's written one about the culture and history of private secondary education. And I mean, after that, it's just you can do a web search for that. And let's see, I see Jane there. She's looking at something. Did you want to mention something, Jane, about some of your
Well,
research?
the full title of my book is The Origin and Naming of Branford Streets. And that can be on Amazon. The library has it. So.
Ooh, that's not well spelled. I don't like this keyboard very much. Okay. Okay, and if you search Jane Bull, the author, you'll see a lot of other items, again, all over the place. So we got that from Britt. Any other questions that we should field? Okay, let me take a last look at my notes. Jenna, first a time check. You've been more than kind to stay on past 8:11 p.m. here. Is there anything else, or with the time check, what time do we have to get wrapped up?
I think I had us maxed out at 8:30, so you've got a little more time.
Oh, okay, yeah. Again, to remind people, look at the website for the New Haven Historical Society. They have a number of professional staff members on site, and I've actually sent inquiries to them about such groups as the Quinnipiacs moving up to the Scaticoke area up in Kent. And let's see, I didn't hear anybody else say that they're a local author. I don't think I mentioned the flax. Flax was so important. Grown locally, you know, you weren't growing cotton around here. There are people who passed through Brantford and said that when they looked off in the fields of flax, that it was as if they were looking at the surface of a lake, because the blossoms were so blue and so tightly packed and so bright. So I'm hoping that at some point the Historical Society can host a linen making demonstration showing a little bit of the complexity of making clothing, you know, processing flax into linen. As Joe said, what do you say, Joe? Something like 60 hours for an article of clothing?
Yeah, and I got that. What's the fellow name? You know, that has one of our looms
Bob Ayudi.
on loan. But yeah, Bob Ayudi. I got that from him. I think he said something like it could take 40 hours. You know. Well, anyway, a long time. You know, to process the actual flax plants until you had a shirt or something. You know, It was very, very labor intensive, to put it mildly.
Excellent. If anybody else has a question, they can put it into chat or they can unmute themselves and ask if that's easier. Your unmute function is probably for most screens on the bottom left-hand side of your screen.
Matt, I'm just going to jump in. I'm going to put a link to the library's new digital archive in the chat, just in case
Excellent.
anybody wants to check that out. It's brand new and growing, so be sure to email us if there's anything you want to see, because we've got a lot to get through in terms of digitizing. So we welcome your input and opinion.
Yeah, and for anybody that doesn't want to go look right now because they have a feeling there's not much there, go look anyway. There are so many articles through the Blackstone Library website that have interesting Brantford history and tidbits. I've used it for a long time. There are a couple demolitions planned around town for homes that are old but not protected by historic districts. And I've been able to glean some information from the Blackstone Library website for those to help us take a look at the historical significance of those houses. But otherwise, I think it's about up. So I'll wrap up. I want to thank Mike Russo, our programs coordinator. I think he might have come in right at the point where I was stealing his thunder by introducing Joe. But Mike, thanks as always for a great job setting up this program and the previous one from Joe, and for the other programs we have coming up. Joe, thank you as always for presenting. This was great. I almost want to have like although it would drive Jenna crazy, have just a monthly Branford history chat.
It's fun.
Jane, thanks for your contributions. Participants, thanks for your input. Jenna, thank you as always for your patience, for your very kind smile, no matter how much you think inside. It's probably been a long day for you already.
Always a pleasure with you guys. I'm a big history nerd, so it's always fun.
We look forward to getting back to the library. I understand also the library is offering browsing in the stacks by appointment. Is that how it's operating now?
Yes, we have 15-minute browsing appointments throughout most of the day, and we also open the computer lab 3 times a day most days for an hour each. So we do ask that you make an appointment, but we are open for computers and browsing.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Our thanks to the rest of the staff there, because I know it's an army of people who do great work there, and thanks to Karen for allowing us your services. If there's nothing further, I'll say goodnight to Liz R., who says thank you very much, and Christine Burkhart, who says the same thing, and Chris and Pat Florio. So thank you all for the thanks. Don't feel like you have to go in and say thank you. By attending, you really pleased us. So on that note, Jenna, is there anything else you'd like to say, or do you want to leave, close the meeting?
No, I just thanks for putting on a great program as always. We do love our joint programs. They're a great way to reach new audiences for both of us. So thanks everybody for coming, and I hope you had a good time.
All right. I certainly did. Thanks.
Yeah, bye-bye, thanks.
Bye.
Thank you again, Joe. Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye.